All right. Hello, sophomores, once again. I have a odd split screen to be sharing with you now, mainly because I wanted to go through a bit of the argument that we were discussing on Monday in class, and actually really just bring up some of the problems that I want to address on Friday. Because this is, as I mentioned in class several times, one of the thornier issues that we will be dealing with this semester. And it's certainly, I don't want to simplify it. So I want to actually spend quite a bit of time talking about the problem at hand. And then when it comes to class on Friday, I will look back to Eleanor Stump's work that I've been referencing as a potential solution to this problem. And I'll talk maybe about some other solutions as well, too. So this video is just going to be talking about the problems that seem to crop up when you take this classical theism that we've been working with in class and you start thinking about creation and how creation relates to everything as well, too. So you can see me now, but I'm actually going to go into full screen for this presentation that I have right here, which is short. But let's see. There we go. So I've made a rather long and somewhat annoyingly complicated argument for you, but I think you should be able to track it given that it's largely what we've been doing in class up until this point in the semester. So I first started with an argument from existence, the existence of God, to the truth of God. And this goes something like this. If God necessarily exists, then he is pure act, or in other words, being without potency. And indeed, God does necessarily exist, since the unmoved mover does exist by his own nature, and anything that exists by its own nature is such necessarily. So therefore, we can conclude that God is pure act. This is good. I think that if you deny this thesis, you have to ultimately say that there's something above God, right? Something that creates God or holds God together or something like that, which we don't want to ultimately affirm. So if God is pure act, then he is simple, since composite beings necessitate potency. In other words, if God was composed of parts, then he couldn't be pure act because it would at least be possible to divide him. And if it's possible to divide him, he has potency, and that would not be pure act. Therefore, God is simple. That's just premise 3 over here, and conclusion 1 drawn together through modus ponens. Great so far. Premise 4. If truth there's a typo there. If truth is a mode of being in act, then it is a transcendental. Since we would say that transcendentals are ultimately different modes of being, or they're different vantages for viewing being, if you will. Truth, goodness, beauty, oneness, being, all these things. Beauty is maybe the most controversial of those, but all these things we would talk about as transcendentals. Then, in the next premise, I say, if truth is a transcendental, then God is truth. And that's just the principle of the inner convertibility of transcendentals. Now, we haven't talked as much specifically about truth itself. We've talked a little bit about it. We've talked a lot more about goodness and being and the interconvertibility between those two things. But if you're going to follow that thesis, like Aquinas does, like Augustine certainly does, then it also follows that truth being a transcendental would mean that God is truth. And indeed, that's exactly what we want to say. Therefore, if truth is a mode of being, I have that typo again there because I just copy and pasted it from the first one, but if truth is a mode of being in act, then God is truth. And that's just the hypothetical syllogism of P4 and P5 put together, right? If A, then B, if B, then C, therefore if A, then C. Then I do affirm in P6 that truth is indeed a mode of being in act, since it is the positive value to the being of a statement, right? Truth is occurs when a statement positively maps onto something in reality. As you can maybe recall back from your Logic 101 days, a statement is a sentence that is neither a question nor a command, and it is a sensible sentence. That is, it has a truth value to it. And that truth value is just simply that the thing that it describes has being. And so truth and being are really ultimately two senses of the same referent. Just like Hesperus and Phosphorus are the same referent, that is the North Star, or not North Star, pardon me, the morning star and the evening star, it's the same star. So too, truth and being are actually the same referent. Therefore, God is truth. And that's just conclusion 3 and premise 6. So far, this is a relatively straightforward line of thought. It may still be somewhat new to you all, but it's not overly controversial right now. Well, let's move now from truth to will, or from divine truth to divine will, maybe more specifically put. Our next premise will say that if God is truth, which we just affirmed, then God either has an intellect, which is distinct from himself, or he is his intellect. God is truth. Therefore, God either has an intellect distinct from himself, or he is his intellect. That should be relatively straightforward. You might be wondering, well, why is it the case that if God is truth, then he has an intellect or is his intellect? Well, I would just simply say that he cannot be truth without either having or being an intellect. It doesn't quite make sense what we would mean by him being truth if we also don't mean that he has intellect in himself, or at very least that it's part of himself. Okay, so continuing on. Conclusion 5, we already stated that. Then premise 9 says that God does not have intellect distinct from himself, since then he would be simple. And we've already refuted that in conclusion 2. If you go back one slide, conclusion 2 says that therefore God is simple. So we've already refuted one half of the disjunctive syllogism. And so therefore we're going to conclude that God is his intellect. And this is exactly what we would want to say with divine simplicity. Okay, well, now if God is his intellect and he is his goodness, then he is also his will. Since, after all, will is just the appetite of the subject to the good as presented by the intellect. In other words, it is what the subject perceives as good by the intellect. Well, now, if God is his goodness and he is his intellect, then he just is his will as well, too. And indeed, since we've already affirmed in one sense, although it pertained to truth just a moment ago, since we've already affirmed the principle of the interconvertibility of transcendentals, and we've already affirmed that God is his intellect in C6, we can affirm both sides of this equation, namely that God is his intellect and he is his goodness. Therefore, he is his will. And once again, this is just exactly what divine simplicity wants us to, would suggest too. That like anything that we're going to talk about God in this sense is ultimately one in him. It's simple in him. It's not composed of parts. Now here's where we get to the problem, or at least the potential problem, or at least a series of potential problems. What do we do with creation? So this comes up if we look at the next premise. If God is his will, then that which he wills is necessary. Okay, this seems to follow, right? We say that God is the necessary being. He necessarily exists. From that necessity, we get to his truth and his goodness. From his truth, we get to his intellect. From his truth and his goodness, we get to his will. And so it seems like his will is just necessary, and so that which he wills is also necessary. And indeed, this does seem to seem right on the face of it. So then we continue and say, well, therefore, that which God wills is necessary, but God wills creation. Therefore, creation is necessary. Now, here is where we start to kind of realize that something seems like it's off. We have a bit of a problem. Now, what can we do? Let's see if I can exit this right here. And, oh, it looks like it's frozen. I'll try to go to a larger screen here so you can see me a little better. This is where we're going to have some problems that crop up. Because if we say that creation is necessary, first off, we seem to have negated one of the earlier claims that we made, which is that necessary things must be simple. A necessary thing can't be compound, composed of parts. And yet, most of us would agree that creation is composed of parts. If it's not composed of parts, then I think we have to fundamentally distrust our senses. But even that, we want to say, at very least, it seems to be composed of form and matter, right? Shape and matter, or something like that. It's divisible, so this doesn't seem to be mapping on with our understanding of necessity. So something's afoul already with our understanding of necessity. Similarly, you might have a distinction between understanding God being pure act and God acting in certain ways. Now, that's not obviously a problem, right? Certainly those two ideas are related to one another. If the wall is gray in act, then we want to say it's in a state of acting gray, right? As long as we understand acting not to be like pretending to be or something like that, then maybe there's something quite right about that. But this does seem to be very different from me, let's say, being in the act of walking, right? Now I'm in the act. And this is somewhat different from what we mean between act and potency. And so perhaps this is something that we would want to distinguish in creation, that creation is different from the act of God, which is a form of being, and the things that God does. But once again, we have a problem with then now we're having to separate God's will from what God does. And if God has to will something and he does that which he wills, it seems like at very least creation might not in and of itself be necessary, but it's a type of being that could not have not existed. And that certainly seems to come very close to necessity. It just could not have not existed, not because it in itself is necessary, but because it is the only possibility of act from the necessary being. And this is just a bit funny. Now, it also seems like we've removed something from the distinction between creation and creator, right? We can maybe affirm the patristic saying, which would say that Deus facit homo Deus facit homo autum fit, which would be God makes, but man is made. And so we could say, okay, well, maybe this distinction is necessary. That God in himself, or not, I don't want to use the term necessary here. Maybe this distinction is helpful. God is himself necessary. We in ourselves are contingent, but we're a type of contingent which must exist. And it's very confusing at this point. And I'll acknowledge that too. We would do well to distinguish between our natures at this time, though, and other types of necessity. So, for example, I can say that it's necessary at this moment that I'm sitting down. And now I mean a different type of necessity here, right? I mean just the necessity in the sense that since it is already occurring, it must be already occurring because X is equal to X. But that's not the necessity that it means that it could not have been another way. Or it's logically incoherent for it to have been another way, perhaps more appropriate. You might say that it's logically coherent for creation not to have existed, but it is in practice incoherent since it derives itself from the necessary being. That would be maybe one way out of this. And I think I'm going to suggest something kind of similar to that on Friday. So those are a couple of different routes. Again, it's to point to the fact that creation, the nature of these two things is different, right? Creation is not by its nature necessary, but maybe it is necessary because it is just natural. It is of God's nature to create. But now notice you're stuck with the claim that God couldn't have not created because it's in his nature to create. And that point is going to worry me a little bit. Because suddenly it seems like God is dependent on creation to be who he is. And I definitely want to affirm the thesis that God is independent of creation. And indeed, that's a very Christian line of thought as well, is to say that God is independent of his creation. Indeed, Christian apologists are going to recognize that if God is love, and he is independent of creation, then he must be Trinitarian. That's one of the arguments for Trinitarianism. I think Hugh of St. Victor is one of the main arguers for that thesis in the medieval era. But you can't really do that argument if you don't want to say that God himself is not independent of creation. So what does this leave you with? Well, it leaves you with that route. You can also talk about the distinction between act or acts and being an act, and maybe that can help you out a little bit as well. What we will end up doing in this class is talking about the distinction between ad intra relations of the Trinity and ad extra relations of the Trinity, and the distinction between existing in oneself and existing through procession from God. I think that's a better route to go. But I will recognize, once again, I started off all of this by saying it's quite a thorny issue. It's a really, really challenging one. And so I think that it's one that's well worth our time thinking about. So I would encourage you to begin working through this, especially as we prepare for Friday. The answer that I give you on Friday will not be simple, and I don't mean that just in the sense that it's not complex. It's certainly composed of many parts, but I mean that it will take all of your energy to understand it. So hopefully you want to. If you don't will to understand this one, you certainly will have no hope in understanding it. And if there is no hope, there is ultimately no love. So that is all I have for you. Please do let me know if you have any questions on any of this. Wait until the discussion on Friday before I can clarify it, though. All right. Have a good night.